Welcome to another Drupal whirlwind, another 2 hours together with Drupal 9. I noticed in my YouTube history that there was a Drupal 8 video that went for almost 2 hours, and I've pretty much recorded another 2 hours with Drupal 9. Not much has changed, except a lot in terms of the layout, in terms of some of the processes that we can use to get Drupal up and running. So more than anything else, in the ensuing 2.5 years, I've learned more about being able to deploy Drupal in multi-tier applications in containerized environments, and that's what this video is going to try to capture. So what you see on the screen at the moment is the specification of what we want to build today. So our 2 hours together involves us creating what is the specification of a document management system. It's a policy system, and our thinking is that we have a workflow, and that workflow involves an author who creates policies and an editor that is going to approve those policies. And create categories and take that policy through a life cycle, through an archival process. We have users, and I think in this configuration, anonymous people can browse the policies by category and see individual policies that have gotten to the publish stage. A few very specific business rules. Each policy must have a unique kind of index associated with it. We want WCAG 2.1 compliance in terms of its visual structure. Content needs to be in some kind of structured order. And breadcrumbs allow us to be able to move up and down a hierarchy of a category, subcategory. So that's the specification in a nutshell. And we'll get straight ahead with installing Drupal and configuring it. So you're in my localhost terminal. And the terminal represents a 30-year-old technology, well, probably more 50-year-old technology. But bear with me on this, because what we're going to try to do is both download and configure Drupal non-interactively. And when I say non-interactively, I mean in such a way that we could can it into a script so that we can instantiate in an automated way. So what I'm doing in this command line can essentially be pasted into another file and then executed when we need it for production purposes or when we need it for staging purposes. So in the development stage, it's obviously preferable to be working localhost because the latency is extremely low, and we're going to spend a lot of time interacting over HTTP, and the lowest latency connections are the ones with 0 hops. So we want to work localhost, and essentially what I've done here is I've used a dependency manager called Composer, and Composer gives us an interface into everything PHP that the developer would need. So it represents all of the libraries, all of the frameworks, all of the content management systems that are developed using PHP. There are others for other languages. So NPM you might have heard for JavaScript, and pip you might have heard for Python. So each has their own different dependency manager where we can look for software and extend our own code to be achieving new and interesting things. So what I'm doing here is I'm I'm going to install some dependencies on top of Drupal. So if I pulled the Drupal core down, what I want to do is I want to bring down an extra bit of command line utility called drush. And what that allows us to do is to make permanent configuration changes to our Drupal instance outside of the administration panel that we would normally access over HTTP. And again, that just allows us to be able to extract a canned process or a predetermined activity. So things like site updates, database schema updates, cache clearing, entity creation, theme creation, even module creation can all be done within this interface. It would also be something that we could do on a timed basis, and that is at midnight every night we could dump the database and then push it via Git maybe up to some kind of a repository somewhere, so that we can have a history of all the backups that have taken place for the last n number of times. And also the file system. So if anyone's uploaded any images or have PDFs or what have you during the process of managing content, we can take a backup of that offline. And even better, we can have it into a code repository where the next development instance that we create on our local machine would identically replicate exactly what production looks like. So we don't have to go through the pain of manually backing up and what have you. We can sort of shut the site down one Sunday afternoon, pull a development version down, do some fixes, push those updates out, and set the site up ready for Monday morning. So it's nice in the fact that because we're using the terminal to build our environment, we are preparing our minds for a scenario where production can continue in a structure that has our modules and our core always at the latest, always with security patches, always with the feature set of the current instance of Drupal. And that's a very powerful thought, one that is different to a lot of content management stewardship that I've ever been involved in that we set these things up, and if we don't hear from the client, we don't do anything to their site. So and that can be problematic, because the only time we hear from the client is, of course, when the site's hacked and when somebody's managed to take advantage of some security exploits. So if we want to automate this, then using tools like Composer, like Drush, like the command line, like Bash, like the command line utility, we can end up automating this process for us. Inside Drush, there's other features like an internal server. So in this case, I'm going to run the server on a port that's not currently accessed or already in use. And I'm going to make that server available to anyone on any network interface anywhere across the internet. So although we're on a firewalled environment, it doesn't really matter. So if I localhost 8090, I should get what is a fairly boring, completely theme stripped site. Now, when generating the site name's been generated, the site slogan's been generated, but also the administration password. So I've got to scroll right up to the top to find that password. So username is admin, password is blah, blah. So I've got to paste that code in and get to my administration panel. Now, this administration panel has no theme associated with it. In fact, my installation of Drupal is in its minimal configuration. The reason I've chosen minimal, partly from a compatibility issue in sort of maintaining the site going forward, but the other point is that we want to engage a minimal permission set or a minimal privilege or a stance of least privilege. In other words, I don't want to install modules that I'm not going to use, and I don't want to install any feature sets that might increase the surface of attack that this site would be exposed to. So you'll see me throughout this video explicitly installing the module and then using the feature, which is unusual because if you did an installation, what you're going to choose is the default installation, which enables most of the core modules, less the experimental and some of the sort of the lesser used ones. So this video right off the bat is very different from many other videos about Drupal and setting it up and running it, only because I'm interested in the kind of work practices that we would need to have if we wanted to maintain a high level of management over version control, a high level of management over dev, staging, and production. And implement this ideal around continuous integration and continuous delivery. So what I've done at this moment in time is I've installed a few themes, but what I also need to do is to make sure that my environment is set up so that it has correct access to certain parts of my environment. So I've had to sort of change the permissions of some of my system, and you'll see throughout the video the same situation occurs in that different parts or different operating systems might, with different privilege, do different things with my repository of system. So in this case, when I tried to do a composer update, it wouldn't let me because it couldn't access the files or the settings area. And when we start using things like Docker and Kubernetes, each orchestration system will then put other sort of users and permission levels on top of the process. So when we come back to dev, we've got a sort of sudo, and we've got to sort of get some escalated privilege to make modifications to our environment. But what I've done here, because I initially downloaded 9.0 Drupal, which is I don't know, December, I think, last year. And now here we are in March. We want to be able to get the current latest version. So what I've done is I've updated it to 9.14, but it tells me in the report, the site report, that the schema, the database schema, needs to be changed. So I can use drush to do that, and again, I can can this process. So every time we instantiate a production or a test or a staging site, we can download the latest Drupal, we can automatically do a schema update on the database, and we can start running with the current latest version of everything. And I know this now because I've looked at all the commands and I've noted them down, and I'm sort of collecting a script, an instantiation script that I would use as a part of the process. Anyone who uses Drupal for any period of time knows about clearing the cache, and again, drush can do that. So we can sort of press the up arrow and hit clear cache. So if you're doing any theme work, or you're doing any sort of entity relation work, you know that the cache needs to be cleared out at some predetermined times. And you can even sort of set up drush cache clear or cache rebuild as an activity that happens at midnight every night. So that could be pretty handy. So I've just started the inexorable process of sitting inside the administration console, and I'm going to start playing with the admin panel to create entities and create routes and create views and create all of the things that a site would need. And interdispersed with that, I'm going to pull down from the odd module that I might need. But I'm not going to pull the module in a way that we would traditionally do that, i.e. look at the website, scroll down to the download option, put the download in our module folder, unzip the module. No. Because we have a dependency manager, what we can do is we can hit the composer install functionality and say, look, I want this Drupal module or this Drupal theme or this Drupal something to be able to install. Composer, just like any other command line utility, has a whole sort of plethora of options. So we can update require, we can initialize, we can, revert back to previous versions, we can remove bits and pieces. But in this case, what I've done is I've installed the administration toolbar, which adds drop-down menus so that I can drill and deep link directly into sort of the bowels of the admin panel. And that gives us a bit of an easier navigation to the places that we need to go inside the administration area. And there are admin facing modules, and then there's user facing modules, and then there's themes and all kinds of bits and pieces, and Composer can be used to install all of those. What's good about Composer is that it also stores a registry for the next time it gets installed. So when we push this project up to a repository, we don't push all of the specific versions of the componentry. We actually leave that all blank. So the only thing we're pushing up to the Git repository will be just the configuration changes that represent our site. So all of the core and all of the modules and all of the themes will be re-extracted with their latest version numbers at the date and the time that we need them. So here I am. I've installed an experimental theme called Olivero, which meets the WCAG 2.0, I think 2.0 AA standard, so AA meaning high contrast and, keyboard navigable and, text-to-speech compatible and what have you. So, and the first thing that I noticed is that Drupal by default allows visitors to register. So I want to immediately disable that feature. Now, of course, it might be useful for you to have that feature. And for example, there's a sort of an assignment that I set up for students to do where we do have to have a registration on. And we probably, if we're going to put this in production, is to have some kind of capture, some kind of I'm not a robot checkbox that some of the Google Authenticator type utility has. So that's a plugin that we might have to search for on the internet, so that when people do registrations, we don't end up getting 30,000 bots all sort of registering a million accounts in the hope that our site gets hijacked. So that public registration process can be a bugbear in itself. So I'm having a look at the home page and 404 errors. So if someone hits our site incorrectly, we can redirect them off to home, or if someone sort of wants to visit the home page, we can give them a certain user experience. But at this moment in time, logged in as admin, there is no content. There is no ability to create content types until we install the module. There's no ability for us to create taxonomies until we create the module. So we've got to really build this content management system up from scratch. And there are some things missing. So when you look at Olivero in other YouTubes, or when you've installed it and played with it yourself, you'll see the search options, and you'll see a number of extra blocks that represent other modules that haven't been installed in this particular instance. And ultimately, I'm not super interested in even sort of going there, so to speak. So I'm creating a new content type called policy, and based on the specification, we need to have these policies go through a workflow. These policies are initially published as draft, so their initial state upon saving need to be set in a state where they can't be seen, and then they need to go through a workflow of approval. And when they've been out for long enough, they'll get converted to an archive state. And be obviously replaced with another piece of content. So I'm removing all those options that says, create a link, automatically publish it. But I am implementing version control. So one of the reasons why Drupal is loved by governments and large bureaucracies is really because of the audit trail that can be placed on a piece of content. So we can identify a forensic of everything that's happened to a piece of content over its life cycle. Who edited, when they edited, what they edited, and we can do reversions and we can do sort of rollbacks of that content depending on whether we have a rule for it. So I think that's sort of one of the core policies of many state and federal governments is that there is some kind of history and some version control around our content. And it's ineffective if we use Word documents. Word documents are a pain in that respect. We have to rely on users to manage their own documents and manage their own version control. Whereas in a properly content managed or a proper document management system, that versioning is done for us. So really what I'm doing here is creating a piece of content, a specific content type, and assuring myself that what we're doing is we're making sure that this policy can't be created straight off the bat. I'm sitting here as admin at the moment, so I can sneak in as admin and just confirm in my mind that I can create a piece of content. The first concern I have, obviously, is that I don't want the title of the document to be editable by a user, and I'm going to need to install a module to resolve that, so that the user will, when they create a policy number will be allocated, such as something that has the year that the policy was instantiated, maybe the policy category, and then the node number that's associated with it, so that there is this nomenclature that's associated with the way in which a piece of content is created, and that's possible. It's just a lot of little utility modules have been made by developers over the years to achieve these bespoke things that clients have asked for, and Drupal's particularly good at doing that. Module creation is not something that non-programmers or sort of new users would really want to adventure to. But again, have a look at Drush, because Drush does allow you to create boilerplate modules that you might be able to make superficial tweaks and therefore play in that ball game, so to speak. I'm having a quick look at menus and making sure that my navigation module is enabled, my date time is enabled, my taxonomy is enabled. So I'm going through now and I'm just making sure that I'm getting the modules that I need to make my my operating system do what it should. So that extension or that extensibility around Drupal is its core feature. So Drupal's generally made on a kind of an onion skin, so to speak. The underlying system is a low-level framework called Symfony, and that's why SYMFONY, no PH, it's F. And that's probably just so that it can be searched on the internet in the way that it was written. It's a very well used development platform for developers who even have a lower level view of creating server side applications. Used heavily for API development, used heavily for sort of very bespoke applications. But it turns out applications like PageKit and Joomla and Drupal all use the Symfony as their core. So, and then we move up to Drupal core itself, which is basically a skeleton for plugins to sit on top of. So, and that allows the team, the Drupal team, to be able to be specialists in certain areas. So, there's content experts, there's security experts, there's logging experts, there's theme experts, and there's a number of specialists that can have their own domain without stepping on each other's toes. So to some extent, features are quite fully flushed out in these frameworks simply because of the extensibility of the environment. So I'm still flutzing around looking at different types of plugins that I want. The one that I do need is content moderation and workflows, because I need to move my content from state to state, from draft to published, from published to archived, and I also need the taxonomy, and I may get to layout builder depending on sort of how we go for time. But layout builder is quite nice in that if we have a content type, we can define the layout of all of the pieces of content in our content type. And you may have noticed that when I built my content type policy, I can add whatever fields that I want, and that has a distinct advantage over many other content management systems that may only give you a title and a body and then store some metadata like author and date. With Drupal, you can set a content type to be any field you want, or any number of fields, or any multiple values of that field, or images, or even links to other pieces of content. And that's sort of the beauty of this environment, is that it can sort of emulate databases in a lot of ways. So it's sort of a student this semester said, this is the configuration simulator 2021. And I had a good LOL at that, because it's exactly true in that instead of programmatically describing rules to allow us to create bespoke applications, what we're essentially doing is going through a number of configuration stages to define the architecture in which end users will navigate their way through the complexity of building an information system. And that's sort of really where computing is at the moment, is trying to grope towards a level of abstraction such that we don't have to write low-level code. So, in the 60s and 70s, we wrote assembly, and in the 70s and 80s, we wrote, 3GL or procedural programming, and then object-orientated, and I think content management systems are just another type of programming, but instead of programming with sort of specific logic or specific structures, what we're doing is we're graphically navigating through a set of interface items. So and as such, this video won't show any of the testing, which would just end up being sort of a 4-hour video, and we don't want to waste too much time. What I'm interested in is sort of taking you through a process. So we've talked about what we're going to do in terms of a document management system. We've installed Drupal itself, and now we're really trying to work out how we can build pieces of content together and structure them together. So if you look across the top, we've created pieces of content in a certain structure that have a certain look, with a set of modules that provide those features. So in many different instances, all I'm doing is having a look closely at what are the features that I need. So what's missing, not only dates and times, but also graphical editing. So there's a JavaScript type editor called the CK editor. It used to be FCK editor, but obviously people did have problems pronouncing that. So they took the F out. But that CK editor gives us a sort of a beautiful interface to allow us to set bold and italic and lay out tables and set colors for our text. The interesting thing about Drupal, though, is that it uses a fairly restrictive set of rules around what content can be created. So the text formatting fits within sort of a very sort of refined set of HTML elements. So, for example, you might not be able to put script tags in, or even PHP tags, because that would represent sort of a certain security risk. So we do have restricted HTML in creating content itself, and will give users the right to maybe drop images in, lay out sort of text, but certainly not. There'd be some validation in what goes into those fields to ensure that we don't get sort of cross-site scripting or any server-side code being executed as a result of trying to render some of our text. In a lot of ways, Drupal gives us a pretty clean sort of environment to work from, and our minds are open to the challenge of providing something that is bespoke to the client's needs. The flip side of that coin is obviously Drupal does nothing out of the box. Like it's completely ill-configured to do anything, and quite a lot of forum time has been spent talking about how can we make Drupal more applicable, because when you look at WordPress, for example, its functionality is writ large. As soon as you install that and unzip that and start running it on a server, it's pretty damn clear that it's a blogging platform. To a large extent, the Joomla followers are the same in that it's pretty damn clear that Joomla has a page building, sort of a fairly free structure for structuring pages. And, of the three, Drupal, Joomla, and WordPress, Drupal fits into the sort of the also-ran category. It's sort of falling away a little bit in terms of its utilization, and to some extent that's a blight on the Drupal team itself for focusing their efforts towards what I would consider a corporate area or a government client. So quite often when you talk to some of the salespeople that have a lot of large scale contracts, they don't call it Drupal. They call it GovCMS, or they call it whatever distribution or whatever brand that they've sold to whatever government or corporate client that they're pushing into. So Drupal in itself is sort of suffering from a little bit of fractionalization in the market, because it tends to be seen as a number of different things to a number of different users. So I don't think it's going to disappear anytime soon, but certainly its use cases will start to restrict until we can get sort of a nice wizard feature to sort of instantiate for non-profits, or to instantiate a system for shopping carts, or instantiate a system for, and in this case here, some kind of, moderated content process or newspaper process or something like that. So I'm still playing with content types, and I'm still sort of confirming that there is the structure that it needs to be. And you can see that there's a little drop-down menu for changing the content type. So the summary is in just plain text, but the body has been set up in such a way that you can edit HTML. So there is like bold and italic, and creating a link, and creating a bulleted list, quotations, and inserting images. Very restrictive in its utilization. So you can go into the configuration and actually update the editors themselves, and then extend the way in which the editor will work. So you can end up sort of putting a few more things into that editor to make it a little bit more powerful. What we're looking at here, and one of the things that happens when we change themes, is some of our blocks get a little bit messed up. The way in which Drupal knows about where things should sit. So for example, that powered by Drupal thing usually lives in the footer, but when you reset the theme, sometimes it'll go into the header instead. And what I'm doing here essentially is creating a new block, and then sort of defining a new role for that block, putting some new content in that static block, and then sending it to the footer, so that we end up having, so instead of powered by Drupal and a little tiny Drupal icon, we've got something that might be more befitting the footer of a government site. So we can end up building what is a template, both of style and of substance. So the block layout system is a way in which we change the substance. We define either static pieces of content or dynamic in the form of navigation or in the form of views or in the form of content editing or even the layout of a policy. But what I'm having a play with here is just sort of looking at the different ways in which we can set blocks up so that we can create our own custom blocks. And that was the plugin, again, a plugin that wasn't installed. One of the reasons I like to start from an unconfigured Drupal instance is I note that if you do go to the fully configured Drupal, it's hard to turn off those core modules. Like once they're installed, once they're turned on, once there are things that depend on those modules, i.e. Pieces of content you've created or navigation you've created, you can't uninstall them when you've finished your dev processes and that you're now ready to go to production. So it's kind of nice in that what you do is you build up this bespoke version of Drupal with only the things that are needed at that time. So you can see throughout this video, I'm interdispersing the visitation to the extend menu, going to modules and installing the piece that I need at the time that I need it. Certainly a pain if you're learning how to use Drupal from the beginning, because you might not know what features are available if they weren't already turned on for you. So there's 3 modes that you can install Drupal at if you just choose the stock standard Drupal 9.1x. There's the minimal, which I've done. There's the standard, which contains pretty much all of the core modules enabled, and then there's a demo mode, which creates a lot of content and configures that content and has essentially a working site for you to have a look at and pull apart. And I do recommend that you do installations that have these example sites on them. In fact, go to the distribution section of Drupal.org and see what GovCMS looks like, and see what the Drupal Commerce, the Commerce guys have put together for Drupal Commerce. Because these are spins of the Drupal core in such a way that they will work for certain use cases. It would be really nice to put that in an installation wizard. So instead of 3 options during install, you can choose one of 10, and you can immediately configure your Drupal site for a very specific purpose. And that, in my mind, would sort of increase the utilization or the understanding of what Drupal is useful for. I went to the Drupal meetup. In fact, and it was stated to me that because I pointed out that on what was it? I think it was W3 Schools survey. Every year there's a developer survey. So a number of, like, GitHub do a developer survey, and W3 Schools does a developer survey. And anyway, one of them said, what is your most liked and most loathed? And I pointed out at the Drupal conference, the meetup, that Drupal appears very high on the most loathed frameworks of web developers. And he pointed out, he said, "Look, I've got an alternative graph to show you." And he showed one of where he compared all of the corporate type content management systems, and those that had experience with them, those that had to use them in their professional lives, tended to sort of highly rate this platform after they got to know it. And again, if I bring another student up, week 1, I hate Drupal. Drupal's the worst. And then week 4, week 5, I'm starting to like it. So there's a little bit of, once you understand what it can do for you, once you have an idea for its advantages, it starts to become something that you might use as your development platform. This is the gateway drug for non-programmers to do what are programming related activities, and I think that's an important distinction to make. I spent a couple of years working for a startup that tried to do exactly that, tried to build a system, an information system where you just did drag and drop. I think Drupal does that pretty well. Like it's pretty much it's a framework without any functionality from the first moment, and you've got to spend a day to set it up in such a way that would meet a specific client requirement. The only difficulty is, it's hard to get started when you have to get started. So I'm here having a bit of a play with the CK editor. And CK editor, it looks like it's gimped out of the box. So it is possible to get a number of editors. So again, the extensible nature of this environment, CK editor, there might be 3 or 4 CK editor modules that allow you to do a number of different configurations with the environment. This one looks a little bit minimal, but it does reflect the fact that minimal HTML is allowed for end users, and it tries to sort of make you need what is a minimal set of tools to lay out content. I noticed that, WordPress uses Gutenberg now. So version 5 of WordPress has a different style editor, which to my mind sort of harkens to a bit more of a modern set of ideals. This one's a little bit word orientated, but when you look at Gutenberg, it's a little bit more block orientated, in that what you're doing is you're dropping blocks that have 3 columns, or you're dropping a table, or you're dropping different pieces of interactivity into the content. Whereas what Drupal is more of a blocks orientated. The functionality hides in blocks, not the content. The content is fairly static. Whereas WordPress, what we do is we install a module, and then we say where does that functionality sit within the content. So it's somewhat of a different way of thinking. So if you're coming from WordPress and you've been given a Drupal job, you've got to think the way Drupal thinks, and that is probably, I don't know, in some ways a bit more of a traditionalist ideal, in that you need to architect the page as a whole. And think of content as static, the actual pieces of content itself. So you end up sort of using Page Builder to define the interactive elements you want in the form of a block layout. But the data flow, the workflow, the permission system is all so much more granular than WordPress. So I don't want to make this a big WordPress pile on, but WordPress has 5 user types, and Drupal has any one of an unlimited number of roles that you can set with granular permissions across those roles. There are ways of installing modules for WordPress to make those 5 user types do granular things, but out of the box, you know what WordPress is. WordPress does one thing very well, and quite often for most of the use cases where I've seen WordPress, it's perfect. It's perfect for sites that have a static kind of character about it. But in some cases, you may have to define a specific process, and quite often customers are very clear about how they want things to work, and to some extent, Drupal can accommodate those work practices quite well. What am I doing here? I'm adding the taxonomies, which represents the categories of policy that I want. So I'm coming up with some example categories for a government organization or a local government organization that might have departments, and therefore each department might have their own category of content, or category of policy. And what's cute about taxonomies is they are hierarchical. So you can have a roads work section, but the highway team and the urban team can have their 2 policies. Or when you're looking at transport, you can look at public transport and commercial transport and private transport. So there may be policies that sort of break down on those grounds, and therefore you can break things out in a hierarchical structure. When Drupal comes out of the box, it comes out of the box with Bartik, which is a theme that doesn't very well support the submenu and the sub-submenu very well. So when you're building taxonomies, and when we go to using those taxonomies, I use this taxonomy in 2 ways. I use it once for my content type. So I'm essentially doing that right now. I've gone to the policy and I've said, look, what I want is I want the policy category to be one of the options when you create a new policy. So you'll be deciding when you create the policy what category that policy sits under. The other thing that I want to use taxonomies for is for navigation, so that the menu system reflects all of the different policy categories that we have. I have to change the form view, so I add the field. I also change the field entry view so that it produces a drop down, and I can move or change the order of the way in which that content will render in a number of different ways. So within Drupal, you can create different views for your content. So you can create a view that would go into you can create a view of content that would go into a listing, or you can sort of have a brief version of that content, or a complete version of that content. But as we scroll down and have a look at the filling out one piece of content, what you see here right down the bottom is policy category, and that's that drop down that we created. So we created the taxonomy, we related the taxonomy into the content itself such that the content can reflect which taxonomy category this relates to. Very powerful stuff. We can go one step further, and in a previous video, that Drupal 8 video I did, if you wanted to scroll back to it, talks about creating a taxonomy, or a special type of taxonomy, which is a listing of content that isn't that can be embedded in another piece of content. So in that case, it was, of the batch of cupcakes that you tasted, do a survey on that particular batch. So we had two pieces of content, a batch and a survey, and the survey was based on a batch, which, again, taxonomy or something more dynamic, which represents the title of the batch that occurred. I don't like that pink. That's one thing that I would probably change pretty quickly in this particular theme, is that things that are in draft mode have a certain color, and that's fine, but I'd go with a gray myself, or maybe even set a background that says draft, that actually sort of has the watermark behind it that says draft. So it's made clear, especially in policy land, you want to make sure that everyone knows that the document that we're looking at is in draft stage. So the client would certainly want that kind of stuff, and in the theming part of the process, it would be something that worth doing. So I'm having a fiddle with the content type itself, and moving pieces of content or fields themselves in certain order so that they look a little bit better. What I'm grappling with, I think, is where some of the blocks are being laid out in this theme. Because when you reset from Bartik to Olivero, it ends up putting a lot of your blocks in the header when they should be distributed throughout onto the content itself. So you've got to do a little bit of cleanup work when you switch from theme to theme. So just bear that in mind, that make sure you have lots of examples of content before you begin your theming, such that you can see pretty much every type of content that you need to touch with your CSS in order to make it look beautiful. I don't mind Olivero. It does look more modern, certainly more modern than Bartik does. It's still, I don't like the borders around active, but it's there for accessibility. You don't have any doubt that you're editing, that your focus is on a particular field, and that's beautiful in some way, but a bit harsh in others. I'd probably prefer to use color than line. I'm fighting the system because I noticed that again, the workflow is designed in such a way as to not allow you to go to published mode, and that button that previews is not technically a save button. So there seems to be a bit of a bug either in the theme, possibly the way I've set up my blocks, that the save button disappears. I haven't quite worked out why that is, but certainly something that that once we get into the theming part of things, I could sort of find out whether it's in a hidden state and not actually user viewable. The other point is that certainly administrator is not going to be creating content. So I'd need to log in as an identified user that is someone who's allowed to create policies. And I'd log in as an identified user that is allowed to move policies from draft to published. So certainly I'm not testing this in the way that it should be tested. And as a result, I'm not theming this in a way that it should be themed, because we're not going to theme the admin panel. The admin panel isn't our focus. And what you see in a lot of these screens here is not the Olivero theme. It's actually the admin theme that is listed here. So what I'm doing here now is I'm going through and identifying the two roles, author and approver, and defining who's allowed to do what. So again, one of the Batman features of this content management system is I can be very granular about how pieces of content are allowed to be massaged by whom. And what I'm doing is I'm giving approver a lot more leeway to do things than I am the author. So the author can create content. They may be able to edit their own content, but they're certainly not allowed to delete. Only the approver can delete. So in, again, government situations, nothing should be deleted. Everything should go through a defined process of archiving. So we should always have some audit trail of what happened. It's just like Facebook or eBay, like there's no way of getting rid of your Facebook profile, even when you delete your account, even if you're in the EU. So you end up sort of, at least in Drupal land, being able to say, okay, yeah, let's make sure that we can view revisions, make sure that we can, see what the overview page looks like. So anonymous user is someone who is a user of the system, but obviously a special type of user that has not authenticated. Why isn't admin there? Admin used to be there. It was a bit weird. And admin was there all the time, but you had no ability to turn on or off the features of admin. So obviously the devs at some point between 8 and 9 of Drupal decided that, well, what's the use of having that admin column if they can do everything anyway. So I'm adding a workflow here. That workflow is necessary. So I've been alluding to this for a while. So under the configuration tab, there's a content moderation section. So there's three parts to this this moderation. There is the states that the content can go through. There are the transitions that can be made through these states. And thirdly, there is the content that can be manipulated by that workflow. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm defining a transition from published to archived, and I have to give a name to that transition. And you'll find that once this workflow has been set up, we'll need to go back to permissions to permiss the right roles to move that content between these transitions. Right, so it's not the states themselves that people have permission to. Obviously, we can set that, but in our playing of this process, what we're really interested in is who can move the content from state X to state Y. And what I'm really doing here is I'm locking it down good and hard. I'm reducing the options for people to move to different states. So, we can't move back to draft from published. We can only move to archived. And I saw that the other day when I was editing some system for sort of personal profile information. When I edited my profile, that profile item that I edited went to archive and was recreated as new. So in other words, they couldn't do any kind of version control on the content. So they wrote a system that ended up duplicating that piece of content so that the original content could remain in some form. So I've gone right back to my people menu and having a look at the permissions, and you can see here policy workflow. So there's 3 specific things that are related to moving the policy from one state to another. So, and I think I've got them the wrong way round. Yeah, I should have the ticks in a different place. Yeah, the 2 people that are watching this video will probably not notice that. Okay, so yeah, so there we go. We can save the permissions on this environment. So magic happens. So we're getting pretty close to 1.5 hours, and we still. Oh no, yeah. Oh, 1 hour. And we still got another hour to go. So what I'm going to look at here is installing another module. In fact, at the last Brisbane Drupal meetup, the developer of this plugin demonstrated its features, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I need for the policy database. Or the policy system, because what we need is some kind of an index value automatically inserted into our content type. So it was very fortuitous that a local developer here in Brisbane, Vladimir, who convenes the Drupal meetup, actually is a contributor of this particular module, and obviously when you go through the module section, there's thousands of these sort of fairly low download, fairly small bespoke modules that achieve some very specific business process that no one except maybe 30 people in the world need at any point in time during the life cycle of their development. But nonetheless, it's something that I want to install now. And you might have noticed that because my development environment had some kind of a root privilege when they created the development modules here, my composer doesn't have permission to write to that modules folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat. I'm going to give composer escalated privileges. It's going to nag me and say, you better not do this. It's not a great idea. But, you know, I'm getting the job done, so to speak. If I wanted to do this right, I'd probably run it in a container, but I would have to shell into that container and operate it as a sort of an interactive terminal there. So I don't really want to do that. I'd prefer just to sort of push on and set things up properly. So I've installed this module, this entity label module, but it mentioned in the documentation that if you had token installed, then it could dig into some of the features of token. I don't quite know how it digs into features of token, but just in case it crashes on its face, I'll install this module and confirm in my mind whether it represents some use for me. Because it's a contributed module, and if I don't implement with it, then I should be able to uninstall that module or even just remove it from my vendor .json file and stop it from being a part of the next build. So notice that what I'm doing are 2 things. I'm saying please install Composer with on the left, the framework, Drupal, and on the right, the module that I'm after. And I want to be explicit because there may be 4 or 5 projects that are of token type. So I want to be very clear about what kind of token I want to install. So now when I check my contrib folder inside modules, I now have 4 modules, and dipping down to the extend area, I should see now this token module, as well as the entity. Yeah, gotta type it right. The entity label, which adds an extra tab when I'm creating my content types to denote in that specific content type that I want one of my entities of content type to become an automated label. So I end up getting a value automatically allocated, and that suits the use case here, where every policy must have a policy number. Now, I would make the assumption that policy number needs to be, probably the date that it was created, probably the category that it relates to, probably an index number for that category, and then maybe even, some kind of, prefix or suffix. But at this stage, I'm only going to use this entity label to mash together the content type policy and the node ID, which is the machine allocated number that's given to the piece of content that's created. So when I initially create this piece of content, what's going to happen once I publish it is the title will be turned into this index value, and it will be policy number blah blah, instead of instead of a name that I pick. So at the moment, I haven't actually saved this piece of content. It's still in draft format. I've got to go back to editing and scroll down and actually save that. There's a strange bug in Olivero. I think it's hiding a certain piece of content. But you can see there, this is the third piece of content that I put in, and it's of type policy. So the title has now been given some kind of an entity structure that is of my desire or my making. We move on to dates now, and out of the box, Drupal speaks American dates, which is month, day, year. It doesn't speak European dates and doesn't speak Australian dates. It needs to be configured to communicate a certain date format. I'm not sure whether, obviously PHP-based applications can't dig into the local environment of the browser that's using it. It would be nice to sort of, write a plugin that introspects the client browser's locale and then renders the right date format for them. But in this case, it would probably, be a bit of searching for the right module. So my general modus operandi, and it's not a big deal, is just to go into the date format and reformat for Australian dates or European dates. So Europeans like year, month, day, Americans like month, day, year, and Australians and maybe a few other countries you could yell out in the comments for the two other countries that might do it with day, month, year. So we go smallest to biggest. Most databases will store what are called ISO dates, which are year, month, day, hour, minute, second, which becomes something that can be ordered. So when you have your orders of precedence set up correctly, it's not hard for a database to do orderings correctly. So if there was a referendum in this country to change date format, I'd be pro year, month, day. So that's sort of pretty much getting towards the end of our configuration experience. But what I would like to do is to move on to thinking about the way in which we theme things, or the way in which Drupal is set up for restructuring content. We did a little exercise in the class yesterday where we took two core themes. One was Olivero and the other one was called Classy. And when I look at all of the examples, quite often we're looking at developing a sub-theme based on Classy. So Classy is a pretty common sub-theme that's there, and we can use that as a way of structuring a theme from scratch, from absolutely no style whatsoever. So if you sub-theme straight from Classy, what you're doing is you're getting no style, zero style, none. And I've worked in a few environments where the devs are like, that's the world I want to live in, where I build the theme up from scratch, and power to them. But if you can find a theme that you like and then make light tweaks to it, that might save you a hell of a lot of time. But I think I'm jumping the gun, because what I've got in this video here is a little process of actually using the taxonomy in a different way. So if you remember, we set up taxonomy so that we could choose the category of policy that we needed. But again, a little tiny bespoke module that maybe only 3 people have used in the last 12 months. Interesting one in that what you can do is you can set this guy up so that the menu system will reflect what you've got in your taxonomy, and that menu system will automatically link to a view. And a view is a very specific type of functionality, in that a view can be set up to show a listing of pieces of content. So what we can do is we can set up a view that says, show me category X, show me category Y, show me category Z. And each one of those taxonomies is given some kind of an index number. So index 1 might be roads, index 2 might be highways, index 3 might be public transport. And each one of those indexes can be linked to a piece of content or a view specifically. What I'm doing here is trying to get some idea as to what these modules or these contributed modules are doing, because there's an inbuilt help system. So if you install the module that shows inbuilt help, it creates a new menu on the far right, and it'll give you little tidbits to help you understand what's going on. And guess what? Taxonomy menu gives you a 1-sentence description. Taxonomy menu module transforms your taxonomy vocabularies into menus. Well, thanks for that. I really appreciate it. I do have to go back to the module description on Drupal.org to try to find out how to use it. So you may find me tabbing off to that to sort of understand how I need to structure my view in order for that taxonomy menu to work successfully. So what I'm essentially doing is I'm saying, hey, make the taxonomies the navigation, make the taxonomies the choice that you have for each policy, but also the destination for each taxonomy menu needs to lead to a view that will show the number, the taxonomy number, as a part of its view. And you can see here, there's already a view set up for exactly that. And I don't want to use that because it's not actually showing the actual content. It's not showing the policy itself. So I need to disable this view because it's taking the URL that I need for actually rendering from the menu system itself. And I'm going to create a brand new view. And you can think of a view as a query of the data being the content. So what I'm doing is I'm saying I need a new taxonomy view. It's going to look at content. It's going to find the policy content type. It'll be a page. And what I need to do is I need to pass it a variable that represents the taxonomy ID. So I'm going to say the taxonomy ID will be blah. The taxonomy ID will be blah. So I need to grab what essentially is sort of like a hierarchy, which is taxonomy term, and then I use the %sign to say I'm going to substitute whatever the % is for a value which represents the taxonomy number at the time, and that will be a URL parameter. So that URL parameter is going to be read by the view, and then the right content type is going to be delivered. So here we are. I'm going to make things a little bit broader. So I'm going to remove one of the filter criteria that says it must be published. That's so that if you're logged in, you can see both published and unpublished content. You can see the URL, but I have to change the contextual filter. So there's 2 types of filters. There's a filter that represents how the view in itself is going to work, but then there's a filter on what the URL needs to look like. So the specified field represents the URL parameter, and I'm associating that with the category ID from policy category. So it's funny because views is dense in itself. It's probably worth a 2-hour video all on its own. And maybe you might find 1 or 2 YouTube videos that might really dig into the complexities of this. It's extremely powerful. And if you think computers do 3 things, they take input, content types, they process that input, probably cron jobs or structure calculations or what have you, and then they produce output. And in Drupal's case, what we're doing is we're kind of merging the processing and output a little bit in the form of views, because we're processing our information and we're filtering our information in such a way that the views that were entered or the content that was entered gets reiterated back to us in a different form. So we're not technically doing, processing as in Bitcoin mining or, weather forecasting. We're really just reformatting information. We're taking information in, and we're then providing that information in a different form. And that's essentially what's happening here is that I have a menuing system, and that menuing system is linking, look at the URL, is linking to the taxonomy ID, which is embedded into the view that shows the content types that have that taxonomy term. So there's like the circle of life that's going around here in that in that taxonomy is the is the center of the circle. It's the one that's orchestrating how all of those content types are interrelating with each other. So it's a very powerful system if you can use the right combination of modules and the right combination of architecture of your own machination. So we've gone back to the command line, lucky us, and we're going on the home stretch. So the last where are we now? We're at 5. The last 40 odd minutes, 45 minutes is actually deployment. So if you're not interested in doing deployment, then maybe, oh, hold on, I lie. We're actually doing the theme. So we're in here talking about themes. I've skipped the gun. So I'm using Drush here to create a subtheme. And as I pointed out before, there are themes in the core. There's probably about 5 or 6 themes in the core of Drupal itself, and there's only 2 or 3 that are shown. So you've got Bartik, which is the default, you've got 7, which is the admin theme, and then you've got a bunch of experimental themes that have been placed on top of those. One experimental theme is Olivero, and what I'm doing here is I'm cutting back Olivero so that it just allows me to hack in some extra CSS on top of the styles that are already there. Very risky activity, at least taking what essentially is a complete working set of theme and then trying to weave my architecture through it. Pretty challenging stuff, because you end up really having to understand how that theme was put together. And what the rules are for that theme. A theme is made up of a number of pieces. CSS is only one of a number. There's JavaScript. There is what I call twig templates, and there's a combination of PHP and HTML that are wound together. I don't recommend people dick with the templates early in the development process. It's only when there's some intractable piece of content that they've either got to insert or get rid of from the environment that you can't do through the admin interface, that you can't switch on and off with a checkbox. You end up sort of digging into some of the ways in which templates work. But what I've done is I've set up this Olivero theme in such a way that it only becomes the last style sheet that gets passed by the browser. And what I'm doing here, or what has happened here, is that, like I pointed out before, when you change your theme, the blocks start to go awry. They start to move about the place. So you can see the title has moved into the header, and I need to pull that back down to body. And footer's moved up to header, and it needs to be sort of moved down to footer. So I'm just moving a couple of these blocks back to where they should go, so that they don't look so messed up. And that's just a function of the fact that you can have a unique block layout per theme. Because if you look at the top of this page, this blocks page, you've got a bunch of tabs. Some of the tabs relate or relate, well, each tab relates to its own theme. And you can see there, you know which theme is active because it's the first one on the list. So now that I've got the theme installed and I've changed some of the blocks, I'm just, configuring out the picture. And you can see here, there's my one piece of content and the header is moved down to the body. And at this point I can go in and I can edit some of that CSS so that I can just prove to myself that this sub-theme is actually working. I think if you're doing some serious amount of modification of this theme, be warned, when it says experimental, what it means is that the developers have told you that they're going to make breaking changes. I'd feel comfortable about the names of the classes that they're using. I'd feel fairly comfortable about just editing CSS. But, things might go awry from version to version. Yeah, so all I'm doing here is I'm using DevTools to inspect and find the exact class that represents the page title. And then I'm confirming in my mind that I've targeted the right class, saved it off, and I hit the refresh key. My hope is that it'll immediately go to the color that it should. Now, it doesn't always do that, and that's why using the case rebuild option, either through Drush or through admin performance menu, will give us that sort of option to see the latest. The other is to turn off caching in your browser. So just bear that in mind, that you're going to have automatic caching inside your environment screw with you and make your life a little bit more difficult. Where are we now? I had a problem in that I'm still left with the system generated password, which I've long since forgotten. And this is a fairly common problem. And the hackers amongst us might sort of be able to sort of get our ears pricked up on this. Passwords are encrypted uniquely per Drupal instance. So I can't take a password that was generated on Drupal site A from the database and then paste it into Drupal site B and expect me to be able to get into the site. What I technically need to do is I need to make use of what I think are some characteristics of the site. So every site creates a unique SSID or a session ID. And that is used as a seed for password creation. So what I have to do is I have to use drush to generate our password. Now, you don't have to use drush. If you go into Drupal core, there's a scripts folder, and inside the scripts folder, it can do the same. It can generate a password that you cut and paste out of the terminal and then drop in the database manually. Drush is a little bit more friendly in that it will manipulate the database on my behalf, which is sort of a little bit more friendly. And it might be something that you do as a result of instantiating in production. You might have a little drush script that says resets the password to a password that nobody knows. So not even an ex-employee can sort of mess with the production site, and that you end up with the production site being sort of immutable in some way, and that you can only sort of make modifications to a production site if it goes through a proper CI/CD process. That is, it starts out at dev, we make our changes, we push to staging, we check those changes are okay, and only then do we move it to production. Not going to deal with CI/CD today, but what we are going to do is we're going to push up to a repository, because quite often version control is the savior of everyone's ass. And again, very few WordPress sites, very few cPanel sites that I go to have people actually engaging in some, quality backup regime. So what I'm doing is I've created a repository on GitHub, and I'll include this repository in the description of this video so that you can hit it and do the things that I'm doing here in this video. And what I've done is I've sort of described all the things that I want Git to ignore. Okay, so the things that Git are going to ignore will be the vendor folder, will ignore the web core, it will ignore the modules folder, and I've told it to ignore the env file, because the env file is going to contain environment variables. And what I'm doing as a part of leading to production is to depasswordify everything. Because what you notice there, when I look in settings.php of Drupal, I've hand-coded a password in there, or the installer has hand-coded a password in there, and passwords embedded either on server code, passwords embedded in any repository are generally considered bad practice. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to depasswordify anything that's related to this project. And what I end up doing is putting those passwords in an env file, which is ignored by Git, and that env file is something that I would have to hand code for each destination. So you'll find that in certain sort of version control systems or certain sort of CI/CD pipelines, there'll be an env dev, an env staging, and an env production, and each env will contain the credentials for, the production database and the credentials for the development staging platform. So because I've instantiated or I've started a new repository here, there's a procedure that I need to go through in pushing all of the code that you see here up to its repository. So I'm committing all of the files that related those things that I need. So you can see here I was playing with Classy as a subtheme. So I'm going to push up all of the code that relates to everything that I've done in the last couple of days with regards to this repository. And I'm going to then push all of that content straight up to the server. And that's going to take a little bit of time. I think I've sped it up. So I've sort of sped up the video to 400 times speed. So this is not the speed of my internet at home. It probably took me a little bit longer than a minute and a half. In fact, maybe I haven't sped it up. So I have to speak a little bit more about this Git process. Most devs use Git, and the reason they use Git is because we have a history of all of the things that happened since the inception of that particular project. In more complex environments, we might have branches. We might have like a core branch which represents all the development we've done on it, but we may have some branches for client A and a branch for client B and a branch for client C, which represents different historical changes that were made specifically for one client. So I've used main here as the main branch, but we might have a beta 2.0 branch or a production branch or something like that. And again, the CI/CD pipeline would look at the production branch for production code, or they'd look at the staging branch for staging code. So essentially what we're doing here is we're taking everything except for the libraries that Composer is able to pick up from third-party locations. So essentially the database itself, any files that I might have uploaded, any theming that I might have done, any PDFs or images that might have been embedded onto or into my content managed environment. So you can see here, although I have Composer JSON and Composer lock, I do not have the vendor folder. The vendor folder is completely missing, and it's only when I say Composer update will that vendor folder reinitialize and core will be recreated, modules will be recreated, contributed themes will be recreated. My custom themes are still there. The password to my database actually is there. So if we scroll right to the end, you'll see that username, that password is there. And this is the cardinal sin of deployment in Git repositories. So I'm committing the offense that should never be committed. It's funny, like everyone that I talk to says this is the worst thing ever, but when I ask them how they resolve it, it's like the secret sauce. It's like no one wants to really tell me what their technique is, because it's very specific to the production environments that they're using. So if you're using AWS, it might be, procedure A. If you're using Google Cloud, it might be procedure B. If you're using cPanel, it might be procedure C. So each environment, even things like Git, Bitbucket and GitLab, they have special pipelines and special secrets files that you put stuff in. But what I've heard, or what I've played with in most cases, is this .env file, which is what we want to deal with now. The env file will be the thing that helps us instantiate our database and set permissions on the database. It will help us instantiate our Drupal instance and get Drupal to point at exactly the same database that was created elsewhere. So as you can see, we're heading towards deployment land. Our first step is to push code up to a repository. And that just means that it's in this central location where dev, staging, and production can all access. But now that I have a repository, I need to test to make sure I can sort of reconstitute my content management system with what I've pushed up to that repository. So before I delete any code from my file system, I really need to go through a process of rehydrating my Drupal instance back to its original form. And I'm going to do that with Docker. So probably the title and the description of this video might have attracted you, because I do mention Docker here. So here we are at, where are we? We're 1 hour 20 into the video, the 2-hour video, and we're probably going to spend the last half hour dealing with the Docker portions of things. So my first job essentially is to create a Dockerfile. And what that Dockerfile or Docker Compose file does is it describes the network in which all of my services will exist, right? Now, network, what network? Well, when you're building microservices, what you're building are individual pieces that do one thing and one thing only. So the database needs to live in its own container and do one thing. Drupal itself, with its PHP and its PHP interpreter, needs to be in its own container and do one thing only. I'll make a third container just to help me assure myself that my database is working successfully. So for development purposes only, I'm going to make a third container, and that one's called the PHPMyAdmin. You may have used PHPMyAdmin to instantiate your database, and you may have used PHPMyAdmin to back up your database. In the CI/CD world, that interaction is not recommended because, again, a human's involved in that, and we want to take humans out of the process. If we're developers, what we want to do is we want to develop a pipeline that takes care of itself. So this particular process is an attempt to try to sort of create what essentially is an environment that will work on all of our states, on our staging and our production and our dev. So in theory, what I'm testing in dev should work exactly the same way in production. So there will be no doubts, no questions, no concerns, because the libraries and the environment will be the same on all platforms. So if we break this guy down, what I've got, and you look at the lines that are indented from the top, it's the version of Docker Compose that I'm creating here. So version 3.1 is my version. So over the last sort of 5 years of Docker, there's been a few different versions of the way in which we declare these files. Then I list services, and services are high-level things that I'm going to do. Those services represent the the individual containers that contain the functionality that I want. So DB, PHPMyAdmin, and Drupal all represent 3 containers. My indentation's not quite right. I've got to move ports in a little bit. And then each one has its own sort of little bits of knowledge. So the common things amongst them are image, container name, restart, and some of them have volumes. But the image represents the type of container that I want to create. So I want to create a MySQL container that just has the database. And I want to create a Drupal container that just has Drupal. I want to create a PHPMyAdmin container that just has PHPMyAdmin. Now I'm getting a little bit tricky, and what I'm doing is I'm exposing the container to my development environment. So I'm saying, hey, look, the SQL folder that represents the dump of the database, I want to push that into the database container. And the Drupal site, I want to have a volume that pushes my Drupal site into the Drupal container. And if you note there, the database does not have any exposition outside the container. So I'm not exposing any ports to the outside world from that container. The only way anyone's going to be able to access that container is from within this network, that has 3 hosts. A host that is the Gov database, a host that is the Gov DB admin, and a host that is the Gov interface, so the container name. And I'm finally working out this all-important env file, and I'm incorporating environment variables that each container has, and I'm linking them with the env file. So the env file is going to have a dbu, dbh, dbp, and a db. And each one of those represents one of the 4 things that I need each container to know about each other. So the database needs to be known by PHPMyAdmin, and the database needs to be known by Drupal. So essentially, when I create this file, what I'm doing is I'm declaring all of the features that I want the microservice to inhabit. I need to do some weird stuff with the Drupal container, because if you remember, when I pushed up into Git, I didn't include any of the composer libraries. So I've got to tell the Drupal container when it wakes up, hey, go out to the internet, grab all of the libraries that we need, delete whatever is in the HTML folder, the public HTML folder, and then put my Drupal instance there. So there is a little bit of sort of upon instantiation, please do these 3 things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to build this Docker instance, and I'm going to build it badly. In other words, I might even forget to include this env file. So what I know I have to do, and I mentioned this before, is that I have to go down into my PHP and absolutely eradicate any of these specific users and specific passwords. And I'm removing them from the environment completely by replacing them with the env superglobal in PHP. So $$_.env is in PHP terms a superglobal. So you can access things about the request and the response object. You can access session information. You can access server information, but you can also access the environmental variables that were pushed into it from, in this case, that Docker compose file. So what I'm doing here is just making sure that I'm using all of the specific names that are exposed to this container, so that we can see the database name, the database username, the database password, and in the last one here, the host name. And the host name isn't localhost. So in most cases, you'll know that the database lives right next to the web server. So you're always saying localhost 3389, no 3306. Sorry. No, not in a microservices architecture. You've got your database living in a different location. So we define them by their host names. So each machine has a name on that network. So I'm going to try and do a build, but it's going to tell me, hey, you haven't set your environment variables yet. Bugger, I go. But let me confirm what I did wrong by looking at the config file. And what this does is it prints out a version of the config file that has been interpreted by Docker Compose. And you can see here, there's my configuration file, and all my environment variables are empty. I've stuffed up. So I need to go back to the start, and I need to say, oh, yeah, you're right, silly me. I'll grab this information again, and I'll create my .env file. How does Docker Compose know about .env? I don't know how it knows about env. It just knows. It's like some omnipotent god. It looks for .env and it says, yeah, okay, no problem. You want env? I'll find env. It's sort of the standard for every type of dev environment. So when I look at React apps, or when I look at Symfony apps, or pretty much any web app, this .env file is pretty much a common place to hide secrets. So what I'm doing is I'm putting some weak username and weak passwords into this structure, but it may also be a machine generated thing that comes out of your your CI/CD process, your Bitbucket process, or your GitLab process, or even GitHub Actions. You can set up actions to end up writing these files with things that come directly from your cloud secrets file. So now that I run this, you can see that the username and the password and the database and the host name are all there. They should be in the right places. And I should be able to run Docker build, Docker run, Docker up, Docker down, Docker RM. So it should look at this file and then pre-populate each one of those containers with the credentials so that each container knows about its brethren. So what have I done? I've said Docker Compose up. So here I'm still on my local machine, and I'm still working with local resources of this machine. But the point that I want to make is that if I use something like Docker, what I'm doing essentially is I'm finding this common ground between what happens in the cloud and what happens on my machine. So I end up having the same environment in both cases. And I sped this up by 1,000% because my internet connection sucks. So please don't assume that I can move, what essentially is a gigabyte of data that quickly. Later on, we'll do the same process inside the Google Cloud console, and I think it's just a little bit faster than that. So if you have to do a lot of container work, sometimes working in the data center through a terminal makes a lot of sense because your iterations are much faster. So I'm going to test this. So I type localhost and then 999, and I should get to the database. And you can see the database name is exactly the name that I gave it in that Docker Compose file. Everything is sweet and cool, at least from the database's perspective. I'm still waiting for the Drupal container to arc up and pick up all of the Composer libraries that it needs. So it goes out and it calls Composer. So how many times today have we called Composer? A very busy site. Hopefully it's got its different versions of the site in different parts of the world. Its whole CDN network is set up correctly because there are petabytes of data that are moved in and out of Docker Hub, and petabytes that NPM and Composer use. And I did notice with the I think it was the admin menu, or no, the taxonomy menu, actually didn't go to the repository. And you can see here, my container, the container that I created for Drupal, doesn't have Git installed. And what's happening is that one of my modules, which one is it? It's the taxonomy menu is not actually using Composer's internal repository. It's been redirected off to someone's own Git repository, which is a bit cheaty because there isn't the all-important sort of integrity checks that Composer would do to make sure that that version is MD5'd with the right checksums. So I think someone wants to get lots of downloads and lots of stars against their Git repository and look like a He-Man. So my desire to use taxonomy menu has fallen just a little bit now as a result of the fact that what I've got to do is I've got to modify the container so that it has the Git command in it. So I'm not sure whether it has drush, but I didn't need drush in that instance. Although if I needed drush, I might have to use Composer. Well, hold on, I am pulling drush. I'm pulling a version of drush with Composer. So Composer is installed, but not Git. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to go visit the Docker Hub that I got my Drupal container from. And then I'm going to drill down to the GitHub repository and see how or the way in which they've built the container. Because what I've got to do is I've got to add another layer on top of that container, just like a layer cake, to add the git command. So I'm identifying here what is the container that I'm pulling down. So I need the Drupal 9 with PHP 7.4 on an Apache platform. So I'm going to say my Docker container is going to need that as its prerequisite. And I'm only going to really do one thing. I'm going to grab the apt-get line. So if I look in Docker Hub, what I can do is I can be inspired by how they've built their Dockerfile. So if I look at the Dockerfile, I can see where they've done their apt-gets because it's a Debian system. So there's a few different distributions of Linux that you can use inside a Dockerfile. Microsoft has stolen a few core developers from Google to help Microsoft build viable Windows Docker instances with varying degrees of success. But you can see here, these are the lines that I'm looking for. I need to get apt-get install git. So I need to grab that line, and straight off the bat, I think I'm making some syntax errors because that final backtick or that backslash needs to be removed from git there. So I'm replacing a library that's already been installed in the container, and I'm replacing it with git. So, and sometimes there's sort of the last line might say expose port X, and it might say run or create a startup file. But I'm not interested in any of that. All I want to do is create a brand new layer that just contains the git command, because that's the reason why my Docker Compose is failing. So I'll save that out, and I'll try the Docker Compose up command after I double check this. I'm not sure why I'm here. Oh no, hold on, that's why. So I need to actually change that image because that image reference is now in the Dockerfile. So instead of saying please pull this image inside Docker Compose, now I'm saying please build from this Dockerfile, and the Dockerfile itself has the label that I'm building from. And I still think, so what's happening now when I say Docker Compose build, it's attempting to build that new Dockerfile, and it's failing because it says failed to build the command bin sh git return to non-zero. So code 100, in a lot of Unix systems or POSIX systems, returning a 0 means, yes, success. The program completed successfully. When you receive a non-zero, whether it's -127 or in this case returned an error code of 100, it means that it failed in some way, shape or form. So what I'm doing is I'm getting rid of all of the backticks, and I'm hoping for the best now. So you can see the iterative process that I'm going through. I make a change, I try it again. It attempts to build that Dockerfile, and I'm pretty sure that it's going to fail again. So if I go back to how that Dockerfile was created, and I attempt to copy more specifically the lines that they used in GitHub, they start off by saying, oh yeah, I'll update the apt system first, and then I'll install Git. And that's when sort of magic happened. So what have I called by doing this? I'm still saying Docker Compose build. So what that means is that I need to look at all of the build lines inside my Docker Compose file and actually intentionally build those into the images that will eventually be run. So it's going through and it's checking for any new libraries, any new software that container will use, as well as grabbing the Git. And I highlighted a line there, which is a sort of a hash code. That represents the one new configuration that I place on top of the configuration of Drupal 7.4x on Apache. So I've made one tiny little alteration to what is a fairly large and confusing operating system. So as a result, the only thing that I really need to send up to the internet is just that layer. So if I need to store my version of Drupal in a repository somewhere, it really won't take up that much space. The source of that will remain a part of GitHub, a part of Docker Hub. So it says that the server is up successfully. So what I can do is I can change the port number from 9999 to 9998. And I need to change the URL because I used 9988 in another project. So I hope if I, press the enter key, we're missing the top of the tab there, but I'm guessing that it's loading successfully. Or not. So the iteration continues. We have a forbidden, and I think the forbidden is related to the fact that my Drupal instance did not actually go into the public folder. So I'll work that theory out by actually going into the running container. So what I'm doing is I'm using my command line to go into the computer that's currently executing without its Drupal. So if I choose the runtime name and then say, what is it that I want to do in there? I can just check via www.html and identify what it is that went wrong. So you can see here, this is where all my project is. So when I instantiated the container, there's my Drupal. My Drupal's there. It seems to be good. But when I go to via www.html, there was nothing there. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to link this guy while the container's running and test it. And it still says forbidden. And it's partly because of my linking process. I've got to link the absolute folders. So when I try to go into HTML, it actually says, no, I can't go there. It's not possible for me to go there. And when I go into via www, it will show that my linking, or the way I've linked the two folders together, hasn't worked. So I need to be more explicit about describing the absolute address to those two folders. And when I finally set that up right, look, ta-da! But this is ephemeral. The change that I've made there is completely temporary. When I close Docker down, or when I restart it, those settings will just disappear altogether. So what I really need to do is I need to double check this linking here where it says opt web to via www.html. So I made a boo-boo in this startup command such that things didn't work out as beautifully as they could. So now that I've confirmed my boo-boo, I'm actually going to get rid of everything. I'm going to delete all of my volumes. I'm going to delete all of my Docker images so that I can try this whole process again. So when you create a Docker image, it sits in memory even when it's not running. So what I need to do is I need to actually get rid of any sort of residual image that I might have made before. So I'm just going to get rid of the things that we created. There should have been 3 there. I don't know why there's only 2. So now I've got a completely empty Docker environment, and I'm just going to do the up again, which will go through the entire process of standing up those three microservices and confirm in my mind that Drupal indeed on port 9998 is actually going to work. So 999 produces my database, but 9998, which might take a little while to come up. So it does say it's up. So if I open a new tab or I add that 8 onto the end, it should bring up my all-important Drupal site. So ta-da! There's my Drupal site. I seem to be logged into it. I don't know how, because I don't remember authenticating with it before. So there must be a cookie somewhere remembering my instance. So I'm happy with that. It seems to work. I can look at the structure. There's a few errors that I need to fix, a few things that I'd have to include in my settings.php, and a few permissions that I'd need to reconfigure to make Drupal be allowed to write to certain parts of the file system. But ostensibly, it's standing up when it's supposed to stand up. What I want to do now is push those changes, that Docker compose file and that Dockerfile, up back to my repository. Note that the env file ain't going with it, right? So it's not kosher to put our passwords there. So what I've done is I've nixed all authentication from this repository. This repository does not contain any username and passwords embedded in any files anywhere. That's the work practice. That is the goal. And I think in the industry, you'd be lambasted quite quickly if you start embedding passwords in repositories, embedding passwords in files in repositories. If you start embedding things deep into the system, then you're going to be sort of vilified for that. So think about that password practice. Think about where you're putting your private keys, and make sure that it's in a location and in an environment that isn't going to get looked at. A funny thing that I often see is, and I can tell the hackers what to do, is to sort of go to the root of people's sites and just end with .env, and you might actually see a lot of things that you're not supposed to see, because some people might be silly enough to put their env files in the document root of their site, which is a very bad thing to do, because obviously that env file would contain stuff that we don't want to show. So for the final few minutes, so we're now at 1:45, so we've got 10 more minutes left, and what I thought I would do was confirm that my Dockerification of this actually works. And I like Google Cloud the best. I'm going to sort of put my hand up and say it's the best because of the terminal. And there's a lovely Chrome plugin to provide you with a combination of VS Code on the top and the Google Cloud Shell on the bottom, and you're a rock star. You've got all cloud functionalities right there in an environment where you can do dev work. And if you don't have a computer that's fast enough or powerful enough to run Docker and Kubernetes, you got it here. And the other added advantage is you're sitting at the end of some multiple high-speed interconnects, and all of your Docker pulls are going to happen. You can see here 200 bytes a second, 900 megabytes a second. Oh my God, the speed is amazing. But nonetheless, there's some weird ass things that sort of affect us. One thing that's occurred, at least with the Google Cloud platform, is that it's still stubbornly holding on to Python 2 as its default language. Python 2, I don't know. I'm not a Python developer, so I don't want to judge. But nonetheless, we've got to convert at least this shell into Python 3 so that it will work. So one thing that I've realized is that we have to sort of not only take the env file with all of its details, all of its passwords, but we also have to sort of add some environment variables for the shell that we're in here, so that it'll work with Python 3 instead of version 2. But yes, there's that env file. So what I'm doing is manually carrying around the env file and pumping it into my target environments manually. But of course, with every cloud platform, there is a secrets manager, and maybe you can pull your secrets from the secrets manager. Production environments do not need phpMyAdmin, so I would suggest that that be there just for development purposes only. So we would get rid of maybe a couple of these containers that would be developer friendly. Another point that I haven't made clear is the whole idea of volumes in the Docker Compose file. What we're doing with those volumes is inviting certain parts of our repository directly into our containers. Many production experts wouldn't use Docker Compose. In fact, even the transition from Docker Compose to production-ready environments isn't well defined. It's better defined in a framework called Kubernetes. So there's sort of a fuzzy barrier between moving from Docker Compose to production environments. So much so that pretty much most ops people will just edit Docker files and then move those Docker files into a different type of YAML that is more befitting a Kubernetes environment. That's an area that I haven't got into, but I'm sure by Drupal 10 I'll feel a little bit more confident about maybe showing you a more clear transition into the cloud using Kubernetes. So I'm still sort of trying to come to some conclusion as to why Docker Compose up is continuing to fail. But when I sort of tab out to my searches, because it's hit me a few times now in that the Google Cloud Platform uses Python 2 and not Python 3. All of them, so AWS and Azure and Google Cloud, all now have a terminal. So for a long time, AWS didn't, and now that they've got sort of a beta program where you can run an interactive terminal now, which has the AWS command line and gives you a level of permission directly to what you've authenticated to already. And it becomes very handy because you can use that as a pre-deployment staging environment to test all of your scripts and confirm all of your processes and make sure that you're happy with all of the issues. That little dialogue that came up when I said Docker build is me authenticating my Docker with the cloud platform's Docker registry, because Google Cloud and AWS all have a registry where you can put your built Docker containers into a location before they get put into the cloud, before they get put into production. So you have this special version control system just for Docker containers and nothing else. Just like Docker Hub is a repository or a registry for Docker containers. But what I have to do is I have to export, or I have to set some environment variables before I get past these errors, and I'm incredulous. I'm constantly putting in this, what's the sign of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over, isn't it? So I finally decide that what I'm going to do is I'm going to Google OpenSSL 111 is required by libpython 3. And really what's happening is that libSSL 111 is being used by Python 2. And that's why things aren't happy for me. So where are we? We are now at 152 of 55. So we're down to the last 2 minutes of the video. So we're getting to the end. It's been a long walk. This last one is just a confirmation that all of my Docker Compose and all of my Docker configurations are going to work in an alternative platform. There are other places you can go. There's Play with Docker, which is a nice little sort of playpen. You can walk to somebody else with the Docker desktop on their Windows machine or what have you, and try the right thing out at the right time. But nonetheless, with the last 30 seconds, which just shows me exporting the right two variables and then standing up the environment correctly, I bid you adieu and hope that you picked the right video to spend 1 hour and 55 minutes with. More likely you've clicked at the end and you're more interested in this whole Docker thing rather than Drupal itself. But nonetheless, I'm glad you stuck it out, and I hope to see you guys next time.